So our next speaker, Mark Meckler, comes to us from the Tea Party Patriots, which he helps run. We had his co-coordinator of Tea Party Patriots, Jenny Beth Martin, here at PDF last June, and I'm sad to say she was not able to also join us tonight. I will give Mark a little extra time if he feels he needs it. It's a privilege to have you, Mark.
Thank you very much. And it feels so friendly in here to be the sole Tea Partier. I appreciate that. Now, I'd like to start with a story of something that happened to me fairly recently. And it relates to the fact that I'm the only quote-unquote self-identified Tea Partier here in the room. Over about the past year or so, I've had the privilege to work with Professor Lawrence Lessig. Some of you might know him. He's a professor at Harvard Law School. And you couldn't find two guys that are more ideologically opposed, really. I mean, we could probably argue about virtually any policy decision now facing the country. But over the last year, we've had a series of conversations and emails and meetings where we've realized that there is a fundamental overlap between our beliefs. The overlap really has nothing to do with politics. The overlap has to do with the survival of the republic. Both of us believe fundamentally at our core, in a passionate and frankly fearful way, that the republic is at risk. The lunatics are running the asylum. We're not in charge anymore. And that's not how this country was designed. This country was designed with an incredible faith in the citizenry, in our power as individuals, as networks of individuals, to control the beast that the founders knew would be the government. They weren't foolish people. They understood. They had a grasp of history that eludes, frankly, most of us in the modern world. They read from the same compendium of both literature and history. They knew government history all the way back to the Israelites. They understood the nature of man, I think, better than most of us do. And they knew that we were in for a heap of trouble over the years. But they placed their faith and they built a system around the idea that if citizens paid attention, that if we stayed in control, that we could control this beast that they knew government was destined to attempt to become. This is something that Larry and I fundamentally agree on. And we agree that we as citizens are responsible for the current state of the nation. You'll hear folks in the Tea Party, you'll hear folks in Occupy movement, and every movement across the spectrum and every organization across the spectrum blame the politicians. We'll talk about the corruption in Washington, D.C. We'll talk about the crazy state of my state back in California. We talk about those things as if we're disconnected from them, as if those politicians are not from us and of us, as if we didn't vote for them and put them in office. We talk about it as if it's not our responsibility. But it is. The government that's in Washington, the government that's in Albany, the government that's in Sacramento, California, are our elected officials. They are our fellow citizens, and we are responsible for all the troubles that befall our nation. Whether we believe those troubles are caused by corporatism, by undue corporate influence in government, as I do, I think it also extends to big union involvement in government. We're responsible for those things. We've tolerated those things. We have, for many years, frankly, since the beginning of the nation, allowed the nation to slip out of our hands. This incredible experiment in liberty, and it is an experiment, and it is unusual. This is not the standard in human history. This kind of prosperity, this kind of liberty, this kind of freedom, it is irregular. It is unusual if you read the course of history. It is unique, and it is something special that we should fight for. And at its root is network democracy. And we're here to talk about the future of network democracy, but I think we should talk about the history first. Because you can go all the way back to the founding of this nation, and it is, at its root, network democracy. Living under tyranny, the citizens of the colonies found a way to network themselves. They didn't have Twitter or cell phones or even the telegraph, but they found a way to network. People who shared the same beliefs and the same ideals and the same dreams for their family found a way, despite the obstacles, to come together. And sometimes those obstacles were extreme. Today we talk about the difficulties of the occupiers out in the cold in the park, or the Tea Partiers, lots of whom have given up their houses. They've lost their houses because they're so involved in the movement, they've let go of everything else. We talk about those difficulties as if they're true hardships. But if we think back to our history, if we think back to what those men and women, I call them the founding families, those families were willing to put on the line for the idea of liberty, that they were willing to build networks, they were willing to sign their names to documents, they were willing to participate in committees of correspondence, which ultimately resulted in treason. Treason. Not a cold night in the park, not some family hardship, not like me, sometimes I feel bad for myself because I'm away from my kids and my wife all the time. That's not hardship. It's maybe the sacrifice of a little bit of privilege, but the reality is these original network citizens, the originators of the network democracy, were willing to put it all on the line, every bit of it, everything they had. Their lives, literally. Their fortunes, absolutely, and many of them ended up destitute, and their sacred honor. That passionate commitment you talked about to each other. They were willing to commit to each other that they were there no matter what. In their case, it really did mean no matter what, right? The committees of correspondence, men who got together against the odds, against the king. They had a king, against the king's army, and who fomented, who made common cause together. Again, no internet, no phones, written correspondence, who made sure that the word got out about whatever the common cause was. That's the model. That's what we're doing today. I think it's important to remember, both in humility and pride, that all of us, everybody at this table, everybody in this room, everybody in any of these movements, or any citizen that's willing to fight for their country, what they believe their country should be, stands in those great footsteps. So it started with the committees of correspondence, and the Tea Party started in much the same way. On February 19, 2009, Rick Santelli, financial reporter on CNBC, was asked a question about mortgage bailouts by the government, bailouts in general. And he did what is now famously referred to as the Santelli rant. He's something of a saint in the Tea Party movement. And he's a guy who never profited, who's never actually been involved in the movement, but I think was quite astounded at what happened. And he said, it's anti-American what's happening. We're rewarding people for bad behavior. And we're punishing those who have done the right thing, who have made the right decisions in their lives. We're going to make them pay for the bad behavior of others. And it ignited a movement, unintentionally, organically, passionately. The clip of the Rick Santelli rant made its way across the internet like wildfire. It was kind of like throwing a match in a puddle of gasoline. Nobody planned it. He didn't plan it. Nobody set this thing up. It just exploded. And a lot of people, myself included, saw that clip on the internet. And when I saw it, I worked from home around my wife and kids. I saw what he was saying, and I pounded my fist on my desk, and I said, yeah, that's it. I believe what he said. It was a clarifying moment for me. And he called for a Tea Party. None of us knew what a Tea Party was. I mean, we probably had a little bit of high school history about the Boston Tea Party, maybe some grammar school history. That's all we knew. And he actually called for one on July 4, 2009. And then the social networks took over. There were a group of people who were networked on Twitter using the hashtag TCOT for Top Conservatives on Twitter. And one of those people, Michael Patrick Leahy, put out a call on Twitter, and he said, let's have a conference call to discuss this. Put out a number. 22 people showed up on the next day. Again, totally organic, spontaneous. There was no organization. There was no website. There were no call lists. 22 people showed up. Jenny Beth Martin, my co-founder, was among them. And they talked about, what do you do when a movement seems to have started organically? What can we do to help? What can we do to take advantage of it? And they decided to hold a tea party, or tea parties, a week later. Not July 4th, but strike while the iron is hot. I think you're seeing some of this in the Occupy movement. You have to move. You can't wait. In a network democracy, today with technology, everything moves literally at the speed of light. So they planned to have a tea party the next week, which is 7 days later, literally February 27th, and they put it out on Facebook, and folks started putting up Facebook pages for individual tea parties around the country, and they hoped originally to have 5 to 10 of them around the country. So I found out about it on Facebook. I'm a dutiful husband, so I asked my wife's permission first before I jumped in. And she, being from Boston, thought a tea party was a pretty good idea. So I'm a country boy. We live up in Grass Valley, a little town up in Northern California. And I asked my parents if they wanted to come along. And they're retired. They said yes. Took my kids out of school. At the time, they were 13 and 9. And I wanted to show them what the First Amendment looked like. Now remember, we're what you might call conservatives. I know that could be a bad word here. And we're not used to protesting. I'd never been to a protest in my life. And we decided to do this as a family. 6 of us driving down the hill in my F-350 pickup with our signs in the back, and we're going to protest. And we show up at the state capitol, and the very first thing that happens is the police show up. You need a permit to protest. We didn't know this. We had no experience. Luckily, they were nice, and we were able to continue. We filled out the paperwork, and that day, 150 people showed up at that protest in Sacramento. And I talked to every one of them because I couldn't believe they were there. There were other people out there who felt like I did. And I was stunned by who was there more than anything. And it was everybody. It was every race. It was people from every societal class. There were teachers. There were employers. There were unemployed. There were union members. In California, Proposition 8 was a big deal at the time, the Marriage and Family Act. There were folks that were gay rights activists. There were folks that were pro-marriage and family. There were pro-life. There were pro-choice. Every one of them carrying a sign that said something similar, something about, I want to get government off my back. I've had enough. I can make my own decisions. Whether it was out of my bedroom, out of my business, out of my school, I just want government to leave me alone to lead my life. And to me, that was an epiphany. It was this spontaneous network of people who shared the same passion. And the root of that passion was liberty for all of those people. And Ori talked about feeling and the feelings that are necessary to have a movement. I don't know anything about building a movement. To be honest with you, I'm so outclassed sitting on this stage. I'm just a dad and a country guy and a husband and an American. I'm not a professional movement builder. I haven't read a lot about building movements. I haven't been involved in any other movements. Never done this before in my life, never intended to do it. But I know as I listen to some of these other people speak that they speak the truth. They've learned it through years of hard experience. I learned it the lucky way. I stumbled into this thing. There were actually 49 tea parties around the country on that first day. Over 35,000 people came out and participated. No money, no budget, no website, no Koch brothers. I'm still waiting for the check if any of you know how to get it to me. I'm open to almost anything. So we came home and we were excited. We couldn't believe 150 people showed up. We couldn't believe that these things took place all over the country. And I did what I normally do. It's just my nature. I networked. I started looking at Facebook pages and calling people first around California to say, what did you do? Did it work? What didn't work? What was best? What was worse? And I just wrote all this stuff down. And pretty soon people started calling me. They said, there's this guy, Meckler, up in Northern California, and he knows the person in San Francisco if you want to know what they did. Suddenly, I was the de facto California coordinator. I wasn't appointed by anybody. You know, it's just I was the guy calling around, seeing what people were doing. If you've read Starfish and the Spider, and if you haven't, you have to. This is how it happens. It wasn't really leadership. I was just willing to step up and ask some questions and raise my hand and find out. Ultimately, that led me across the country, and I realized there were people who had done this all over the country. That's how I met Jenny Beth Martin out of Atlanta. She'd done the same thing in Atlanta. Pretty soon, there were a core group of people saying, what do we do next? Where do we go from here? And I saw it, because of my background as a technology lawyer, as open source. This was exactly like the development of open source software. I mean, it was a visual to me. That first line of code had been written, and it was, a tea party is a public protest against a government run amok. It was nothing more than that. And people began contributing to that code. In Atlanta, they said, well, if you have 500 people show up like they did, you need a sound system and a little stage, otherwise nobody could hear or see what was being said and done. In Sacramento, we learned if you're on the state capitol grounds, you need a permit. And this kind of knowledge began being added to the code base totally organically. Nobody led it. Nobody was telling anybody to do it. There was no website still. There was nothing but people who were acting from their passion and creating, as Ori said, circles, totally organic circles. Communities of people coming together in Sacramento, in Atlanta, in New York, in Boston, and they began overlapping. They began communicating with each other, like the committees of correspondence. And that caused the movement to grow organically. Again, nobody driving it. A few of us said, what do we do next? Where do we go from here? We thought, April 15th. People are pissed off on April 15th already. We should take advantage of that momentum, right? That's natural momentum. A day when people are generally frustrated with their government. And we planned the next round of Tea Party protests. Our first website, our first real use of technology consciously. We had taxdayteaparty.com. And there were 5 of us really in the core group who were taking calls and fielding emails and manually listing things on this WordPress website. We had no real technology, and the thing started to crash because 10,000, 20,000, 50,000 people pounding on the thing. We were unprepared. And then it started to get media play, and it became out of control. And we started to get calls from media people who wanted to come to the events. And pretty soon there were 60, 70, 90 events listed for this April 15th event. And we thought, wow, if we could do 100, I mean, we did 49 the first time. If we could have 100 events, it would be extraordinary. And 2 days before April 15th, on April 13th, we had to close down registrations. We could no longer handle it. And at that point, there were 850 Tea Parties listed around the United States of America. That makes it literally the largest single-day, multi-city, simultaneous protest in history. And ultimately, by our best count, and we called literally manually every organizer of every Tea Party and tried to confirm it in every way we could. It took us about 6 weeks. There are about 1.2 million people that came out that day. Natural, organic, network democracy. Our budget for that event on April 15, 2009, 0. Our paid staff on that day, none. Our organizational structure, we didn't have one. And we were able to create 850 Tea Parties. I say we were able to create it. It wasn't me. It wasn't Jenny Beth. It wasn't any individual organizer. I know the book is titled Leaderless Organizations, or subtitled, but this was organically developing as a leaderfull organization. There were literally at least 850 leaders organically spreading up around the country, and the truth is there were thousands. And we decided to continue to play on this structure. That's when we formed Tea Party Patriots. We knew there needed to be a go-forward organization to help lift this movement up, to provide it a conduit. And ever since then, every Monday night, since February of 2009, we have our national leadership conference call. Every local coordinator participates, and they tell the organization what to do. It truly is a bottom-up organization. By the way, I'm missing it for you guys tonight, so I appreciate you hosting me here tonight. You know, Zaina brought up primaries, and while I really appreciate the credit, we didn't engage in the primaries previously. And if you look at 2010, and you look at, we had the sweeping electoral change, it's the largest change of parties since 1938. Does anybody have any idea how many incumbents in the House of Representatives, all of them are standing, right? How many lost their seats in 2010, incumbents in the primaries? 4. 4. That was a historic increase of 33%. The historic average is 3. So it's a fake fight in the primaries, and I think Zane is right. That is where the game is, and that's where we should all be playing together. Because the reality is, unless we disrupt the power structure by turning out incumbents, unless we do that within the party structure, we will ultimately fail to reform the institutions. It's a fake fight in the primaries, and the reality is, for all of us, even in the general election, 78 to 80% of districts are fixed. You live in a Democratic or a Republican district, it's the way it is, no matter what you believe. And so we have to take the fight to the primaries. There's actually an organization called Alliance for Self-Governance, nonpartisan, and they're running something called the Campaign for Primary Accountability. The goal is to turn out 50 Democrats and 50 Republicans in the primaries. Think about that. Now that's radical disruptive change. I think the critical point, and this question's been asked a bunch of times, is the intersection of the existing power structure with this new challenge to that power structure. And I think that is the most difficult place. It's I think, the threshold that has yet to be crossed. It certainly hasn't been crossed in the Tea Party movement. You guys might argue there's a Tea Party caucus. I don't know who those people are, how they appointed themselves as the Tea Party caucus. Honestly, I went there for that press conference where they introduced themselves to make damn clear that they weren't us, and that they didn't speak for us, and that they didn't represent us, but if they wanted to use the name Tea Party, then they were going to be accountable to us. And frankly, in that regard, we have not succeeded. And we have watched some people in our own movement be co-opted by the power structure. It's awful sexy. You know, people get invited to parties and they're sitting in meetings in John Boehner's office, or you know, they're inside the power structure. And when you've never been in there, when we've been excluded as citizens for all these years, sometimes it's very shiny and sparkly. And it's easy to get co-opted by that structure. And people who get co-opted don't believe that they're co-opted. They believe that they're inside and they're doing what's right and just for the movement. So I think that intersection where we conflict with power, where we're trying to change the power structure, where we ourselves are engaged in that power structure and trying not to be corrupted by it, I think that's the critical threshold. I can tell you that we as a movement have yet to cross. I hope that people in this room, people in the Tea Party movement will cross that threshold together.
Hear, hear.
Oh, all right.